The Enchanted Castle by Edith Nesbit book review. Okay, so first, just a brief explanation of how I came to be reading this book. I'm currently living in Asia. Now that has nothing to do with the book, but it does kind of explain why I picked this book up. First of all, in Asia, the English books are limited. And in Saigon, where I'm currently living, you tend to have a lot of these cheap reprints of old classics, the Wordsworth classics, like this. The second thing about living in Asia, of course, is it's not only Americans living there, it's British people, Australian people, etc. So you tend to kind of get exposed to a lot of books that were published in England. So yeah, the selection over here is limited, a lot of cheap reprints of classics, and kind of has more of a British influence. Now, when you go into the bookstore here, they've got all these old classics, Wordsworth classics, and there's two sections. There's the kind of the black covers here, this is Karamazov Brothers, which is kind of like the heavy-duty classics. And then there's kind of the white beige covers here, which are the children's classics. Now, the definition of what is a children's classic, of course, is elastic. Yeah. Some of these books, I think, well, yeah, sorry, let me just give an example. So they've got Peter Pan is in the children's classic section, Treasure Island, Alice in Wonderland. You know, like some of these I think are not children's classics, they're like classics, but like they did start out as children's literature. I don't know. Anyways, point is these are kind of more the books geared towards children. These are kind of more the books geared towards adults, but I think they're all classics. So I find no shame in browsing through the children's classics section. I figure classic is a classic, right? Once it's old enough, it's, you know, at a certain point, it's just kind of gotten old enough that, what's the word I'm looking for? It's enough people have kind of thought it valuable that it should be worth reading by anybody. Now, in the children's classics sections, there are a number of books by E. Nesbit. It's always E. Nesbit in my bookstore, although according to Wikipedia, that's Edith Nesbit. And that she has a lot of kind of children's fantasy books in this section. Now, I never heard of Nesbit before, and I suspect maybe this is because I'm from America, and I think maybe she's more popular in Britain. Although I've learned over the years to be careful about making these generalizations because you never know. Like, I tend to say stuff like, well, I never heard of her, so she must not be popular in America. But, you know, what that means half of the time is that my particular school library in the town where I grew up didn't have her. But, you know, one town over, they had tons of her books. So, yeah, take this with a grain of salt. But, I never heard of her growing up, that I can remember. You can look her up on Wikipedia, though, if you've not heard of her. Interesting person. She was a prolific children's author. She wrote a number of children's books, the most famous of which I think is called The Railway Children. And when I saw that, I thought, I do remember that one. But actually, I don't. I was getting it mixed up with The Boxcar Children, which is a separate book series written by a different author, kind of similar names. But yeah, that one's completely separate. It's The Railway Children that Edith Nesbit wrote, which I never read. Yeah, interesting person, prolific children's author, and active politically. Apparently she was one of the co-founders of the Fabian Socialist Society in Britain. If you click on the Wikipedia link to the Railway Children article, she was personal friends, apparently, with Peter Kropotkin, the famous Russian anarchist. And there's a character based on him in one of the books. Interesting. There's nothing really political in this book, just to kind of get that out of the way, but she was an interesting person who was kind of actively involved in kind of idealistic socialist politics back in her day. This book was published in 1907, so I always figure anything before World War I is like properly a classic. I mean, I know stuff after World War I can be considered classics as well, but I always consider like anything before World War I, that's really a classic. Now again, according to Wikipedia, this book was written, she wrote this book with both adults and children in mind. So it's not meant to be purely a children's book, according to Wikipedia. Although as I was reading it, I was thinking, it's pretty much a children's book. I mean, you know, it's got some charm that adults can appreciate, but largely aimed at children, I think. Although, like any old book, like most old books, the style is a little bit antiquated. So, like, even as an adult, I found kind of the children's dialogue a little bit hard to follow at the beginning. They were kind of talking in all these kind of phrases and idioms that have gone out of date a long time ago, but you do get the hang of it fairly early on. So, you know, like after, I don't know, 10 or 20 pages, it's no problem. Just something that's a little bit jarring at the beginning. I'm getting ahead of myself, actually. Why did I, out of all the books by Edith Nesbit in my bookstore here in Saigon, why did I pick this one out? So I thought kind of, I don't know, I've always been a sucker for these kind of fantasy stories. I thought something like The Enchanted Castle would be, you know, like have a fantasy setting, you know, like dragons, princesses, knights, an old king, a magician, kind of epic fantasy, or at the very least kind of a fairy tale-esque fantasy type story. I was a little bit disappointed with how kind of mundane it was. So it's nothing really, there are nods to kind of fairy tales, but it's nothing really, nothing really fantastic in kind of the immersive sense of fantasy. Sorry, I'm not doing a good job of explaining this. Maybe it would be easier if I just kind of described the story. So it does not take place in kind of the ages of princesses and dragons. It takes place in what was at the time modern day. Of course, it was published in 1907. So Edwardian England, I guess is what you would call it. And there's a group of children, 3 of them, who are kind of staying up for the summer with a French governess because their parents are away or something. And they have the afternoons free to wander the town. And this being England, you know, there's kind of all these kind of ancestral castles everywhere. So just a little bit outside of town, they stumble upon like an old castle, which you find out through the book that it's owned by a lord who can't afford to keep it up anymore. So it's kind of falling into disrepair a little bit. But you can kind of see shadows of its former glory. There's lots of passageways and statues and stuff like that. And then they make friends with the girl who's living at the castle, who is not a princess. She's the niece of the caretaker of the castle. The lord who owns the castle is away for most of the book. And then they, as they're exploring through the castle and they go into the jewelry room, they find a ring that at first they don't realize the significance of the ring, but it turns out it has magic powers. Now actually, most of the book is not about the castle at all. Most of the book is about the ring. So, you know, they bring the ring home with them. They discover the ring can do various things. It can make people invisible. It can grant wishes. It can do all this stuff. So they go off and kind of have adventures with the ring. And, you know, occasionally they come back to the castle. But the Enchanted Castle is really a bit of a misnomer. It should be called, like, the Magic Ring would be a much more apt name for this book. I suspect somebody at the publishing company thought, Enchanted Castle sounds more interesting the magic ring. Let's call it the Enchanted Castle. But yeah, the magic ring is really what the story is about, although there are some scenes at the castle. It's interesting enough as it goes, and again, it's a children's book, so it's a fairly easy read, kind of once you get used to the dialect that's over 100 years old and kind of from England. But yeah, what I didn't like about this book, or I don't know, maybe this isn't a negative, maybe it's a personal preference, it was very episodic. So they get this magic ring, and they discover it can do things, like it would turn one of them invisible. And so then there'd be like this huge crisis, oh no, Jimmy's invisible, how do we get him uninvisible? Or kind of what can he do with his invisibility powers? And that kind of goes on for a chapter or two. And then it gets resolved. And then somebody else will be turned invisible by the ring. So you kind of lurch from crisis to crisis created by this ring with no overarching plot, really. I mean, there's a few mysteries that are teased at the beginning, like, you know, where is the lord of this castle? Which, you know, do kind of come out at the end. But overall, the book is, yeah, fairly episodic. So there's a bunch of things with the ring turning people invisible. And either they get turned invisible when they don't want to be turned invisible, and then there's a big struggle to get them turned visible again. Or they get turned invisible and they use the ring to kind of do things like solve crimes or become a magician or something like that. And, you know, again, episodic. Kind of each chapter will be an episode. Then they discover that the ring can kind of grant wishes. And they discover this accidentally, kind of wearing the ring and just kind of saying, you know, I wish, like people do colloquially. Like, oh, I wish I were older. Yeah, you know, something like that, where they're not really making a wish, they're just using the expression. But if you're at all familiar with these types of stories, you know that the ring doesn't understand metaphors, and the ring kind of interprets all that literally. And so they get kind of wished into a bunch of things that they don't really want. And curiously, they never quite seem to learn. Even after this has happened several times, they still will kind of catch themselves using wish as an expression while wearing the ring. The ring also has kind of a monkey's paw type quality, where you get your wish, but it turns out it's not what you wanted at all. Now, monkey's paw, if you've read the original short story, that's quite morbid. It's not quite morbid, it's just, you know, kind of teaches them a lesson. For example, one of the boys wishes he were rich, and then he does become rich, but he also kind of turns into an old man, kind of obsessed with stocks and bonds. So, you know, like he gets his wish, but it turns out it's much better to be a young boy than it is to be kind of a rich old man. You know, those kind of things. And then each time they get a wish, either something they intentionally wished for or a number of the things they accidentally wished for, then that creates another crisis. And then they have to kind of go through and kind of figure out, okay, how are we going to undo this crisis? And then the crisis gets resolved finally, and that's the end of the episode. And then somebody else will wish for something stupid. And then, you know, a new crisis. So again, it's a series of kind of little episodes based around the ring, which, I don't know, gets a little bit tiresome to kind of read through. Although, you know, if you're just kind of reading this book for a few pages over lunch every day, which is more or less what I did with it, I didn't kind of sit down and read the whole thing in one go, then it's readable enough, relatively interesting, I don't know. It's not meant for me, it's not meant for adults. But, you know, it was written in 1907, so I am totally counting this as a classic book that I am checking off my list in my quest to become a well-read, respectable man. Yeah, what else to say about it? There are some there are some really beautiful passages in here. So again, for the most part, the book is fairly mundane. They're dealing with this stupid magic wishing ring, and they're kind of in the towns or kind of at home with the French governess. And it's not really an immersive fantasy setting. They're kind of in Edwardian England for most of the time. But there are some wonderfully descriptive passages of the palace gardens. Particularly, like, if you're wearing the ring, you can see the statues come alive in the moonlight. And there's, the palace gardens are described as in very beautiful terms. You can kind of see the palace lawns, and there's a lake, and there's an island in the middle of the lake, and gardens, and the statues have a picnic. And there's all these kind of, there's a maze out of hedges, all these kind of things that you associate with kind of beautiful British gardens in the countryside, which are all kind of here in the book and very kind of beautifully described, talking about how the moonlight is shining on the lake and kind of all this stuff. I'm not doing it justice here, am I? But if you read this, the author does a good job of describing it. She also talks about, the children kind of walking around the palace grounds, taking off their shoes and washing their feet in the stream, and kind of seeing the fish down below, and kind of a lot of very beautiful stuff described there. There's also some interesting fantasy sequences. They go underground and they find like this huge dome underground with all these kind of magical things. That's all quite interesting and quite beautifully described. Yeah, what else to say about this? There's some interesting little episodes. Some of the statues come alive. They create like these mannequins. They want like an audience for their play. And so they put kind of like hats and coats on brooms and draw faces on them. And then one of the characters accidentally wishes them alive. She says, "Oh, I wish they could clap for real," or something like that. And then all of a sudden they're alive, and now they've got like these kind of monstrous looking things, because they're created from like broomsticks and hats with just kind of drawn on faces. But these things kind of don't know that they're just kind of monstrous. They think like they're upper class British people, and they're saying, "Could you direct me to a fine hotel?" Only like they can't quite say the words because they don't have the roof of their mouth written on it. So they kind of talk mostly in vowels, which after a while the children can understand. And that's just kind of, it's just silly enough to be kind of fun to read, interesting to read. So there are a few things like that in the book. I think that's pretty much it. I think I've said everything I wanted to say about it. Yeah, worth reading if you come across it. It's more of a children's book than it is an adult book, but I think at this stage it can be considered a classic either way. I'd give it a mild recommendation.